People used to ask me, "You're the guy that started Tooth and Nail." I'm like, no, I know that guy, but I'm not him. I started Take Hold Records. Remember that? And they're like, no, never heard of that.
Welcome to the Labeled Podcast, everybody, or welcome back to the Labeled Podcast, I should say. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in to our first episode a couple of weeks ago. It was about Further Seems Forever. The response has been overwhelming. The numbers and the feedback has been great. My name is Matt Carter, and I play in the band Emery along with Toby Morrell and Aaron Lunsford from As Cities Burn do this podcast with me. We also have a ton of help from the staff from Tooth and Nail Records. So this is a big thank you to everybody out there, listeners, staff, everybody. We're quite excited to bring this new episode to you this week, and it would mean the world to us if you could share this with a friend or leave us a rating or review on iTunes. And here we go. This week's episode is about A&R guy, Chad Johnson. Folks, I want to introduce you to Chad Johnson, the most legendary A&R guy in the history of Tooth and Nail Records. Now, Chad became an A&R guy at Tooth and Nail after starting his own record label called Take Hold Records. It started in '97, was acquired by Tooth and Nail in 2002. Now, let me name a few bands that Take Hold already had that you may be familiar with. Hope's Fall, Further Seems Forever, Under Oath, Narcissus, Ludacris, who later became Norma Jean, 238, Stairwell, The Operation, who later became Me Without You, and a whole bunch more. And as if that list wasn't impressive enough, I'm going to give you another list now of some of the bands that Chad A&R'd or discovered after coming to Tooth and Nail. And that's As Cities Burn, Junzetta, Haste the Day, The Almost, The Classic Crime, Anne Berlin, Ivory Line, The Cherry, Oh Sleeper, Watashiwa, Dead Poetic, He Is Legend, and Beloved. Wow. So, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you just hit the skip 30 seconds back button on your podcast app and listen to that list again, because it's quite impressive. Chad was the guy that everybody was gunning to meet and new bands wanted to know and get his attention and send their demos to and hope that he would represent them or bring them to the label. And with a resume like that, you can see why. And we don't want to give Chad all the credit for that era of Tooth and Nail and all the success that those bands had. Tooth and Nail has always had a tremendously talented and gifted staff, both before and after Chad, that certainly played a big part in what happened in Tooth and Nail during this specific era. But in this episode, we are going to focus on Chad Johnson. And Chad was an A&R man. And lest you don't know what an A&R man is, we'll give you a quick primer on exactly what one of them does at a record label.
A&R stands for Artist and Repertoire, which I admit does not tell you much. Think of Tom Hanks in the movie That Thing You Do. Haven't seen it? Okay. Try Don Draper. Slick, smooth-talking, rich. This is the classic version of the A&R person. A&R people are essentially talent scouts. Before the internet, this meant that their nights were spent at clubs, hoping to discover the next Stevie Wonder or Motley Crue. Days at the office consisted of listening to countless demo tapes from hopeful future Stevie Wonders and Motley Crues. Oh, and the expense accounts. The glorious showering of steak dinners and bar tabs at nightclubs was a part of the chase. Modern-day A&R work is really quite different. Less time going to shows, more time trying to determine the legitimacy and impact of an artist's internet presence. The evolution of the industry has seen the expense accounts shrink, but the basic function of the job is still the same. Find the artist, sign the artist, support the artist from songwriting to recording, from album artwork selection to marketing to touring to releasing the record. Cross your fingers and hope for a hit. That's A&R.
Now, Chad Johnson was terrific at his job. He's built for A&R. He has the ear for talent. He loves people. People love him. And he seems to know entirely what he's doing. And luckily, being an A&R guy in a pure sense is more about people than it is business or finances or responsibility. And lucky for Chad, because in those areas, he sometimes failed miserably, as we'll talk about. But what really separates Chad from anyone else is his ability to gain someone's trust and care and love and fuse it with the spiritual and Christianity and God and take your relationship with him to a level that no other A&R guy on earth could touch. Everybody trusts him and loves him immediately. Here's Ricky from Me Without You.
Chad is such a radical dude that, like, if he ever needed anything and called me up, I would go out of my way to make sure I could do it for him.
And it's not just the artists and the musicians. This isn't an act that Chad uses to garner the trust of band dudes. In fact, it's any of his coworkers or anybody that he meets in a non-professional capacity would feel the same way about Chad. Here's one of his coworkers, Derek Tinbush, who did distribution for Tooth and Nail back in the day.
I always loved Chad. Now, Chad was maybe the one person who ever asked me if I was a Christian, but he was also like one of my best friends at the label. Like it never felt like pressure or anything.
Chad even worked his old magic on Toby and Aaron just recently when they sat down to interview him and spend a day with him for this episode of the podcast.
Well, it's really funny. Like, we've known Chad now forever, and we go to do this interview, and Aaron and I are there, and we're just cutting up laughing, and it's so fun. He's telling old stories and stuff, and then we go to do the interview. He goes, "Okay, let's pray," and it gets real serious, and he prays, and I was like, that is Chad in a nutshell. This guy is just wild. Like, he tells us, you know, he grew up a missionary kid in the Caribbean and in South America, and then it immediately comes from he's a Christian and a missionary kid to he's doing drugs. Like in the same sentence, it's just totally sold out to God and Christ, and also struggles with everything that everybody else does. Like, there's this attraction he has to darkness and light that just wars with inside of him.
Yes. So in this episode, we're going to hear a lot from Chad. Toby and Aaron sat down with him in Nashville and spent several hours with him. So we got a ton of clips to play from Chad. So pay special attention to the spiritual component on this, as it seems to underpin much of Chad's motivations and the way that he sees himself and other people. So listen to him talk here. This is a clip of him, and you can just see very early on he's very interested in concepts of light and dark that will play out over the episode.
Yeah. No, I grew up a missionary kid, so I grew up living in the Caribbean and in South America, and I'd given my life to Jesus after sort of my first run-in with being on drugs and all that at about 18 or so in South America.
Okay, so Aaron and Toby, could you help everybody out here? You've spent time around him. Can you give us what it actually feels like to be around Chad Johnson?
Well, it's pretty intense. He's like always kind of operating on that full speed level, you know?
Totally.
Like super inspired, very excited, like making you feel like Chad signed my band, you know, 10, 15 years ago or whatever it was. And he just makes you feel like everything's going to be okay. Your band's going to do great. You're going to come on Tooth and Nail. You're going to be the next Under Oath. It's going to be awesome, you know? And
exactly.
But it's like that, like you were saying, Toby, then he can go to talking about the time that he like smuggled weed from Amsterdam.
Right.
But he's still excited to talk about that too.
Yeah, I know. We were sitting at his house and we're just having this. I mean, you don't feel more encouraged than when you're around Chad. Like, you just feel like encouraged. Like, this guy's going to never say a bad word about you. And he's one of those people, too, that would never say a bad word about you behind your back. And you know that. Like, I've only ever heard him talk about people positively. Like, it's amazing. And then he will immediately tell you how bad he is. He will immediately talk about how bad he's been, but at the same time being encouraging.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good and attractive quality that people seem to really respond to. But here's Chad in his own words.
When I'm healthy, I'm a visionary, I'm a dreamer, I am inspiring, I love people, I'm an encourager. So there's all these sweet gifts that God's given me. When I'm unhealthy, I'm basically trying to sign everybody up to everything they shouldn't be doing.
So Chad alludes there to an unhealthy side or even a dark side. And We'll get back to that later, I promise. But as of now, in this story, we have Chad as the founder and the creator of Take Hold Records, which was really a powerful thing. It got around. People knew about it because of his ear for talent and the bands and word of mouth and the underground scene that was growing in the Southeast. In a pre-internet age, people like me who were going to college in the middle of nowhere heard about Take Hold because Chad, being ahead of his time, seemed to understand that you develop people and you put on shows and you kind of build a community, and that feels good and people respond to it and it just grows organically. So now let's talk about how in the world did Chad and Take Hold get hooked up with Brandon and Tooth and Nail in the first place?
Well, so he had a Take Hold that was born out of a record store and a venue that he had. And then he just started meeting all these bands from all over his part of the country, the South, East Coast, and started putting out their records. And Brandon, I think, took notice, he was saying, because he had good cover art.
Yeah,
for his bands.
Yeah, for as low budget as Take Hold was doing things, Brandon took notice because they were making great cover art. The bands that Chad was signing were awesome. Now, the weird part about that is Chad really had this strange love-hate relationship, I think, with Tooth and Nail. He didn't like Brandon. He thought of him as the enemy, like the Dark Lord, who was
big corporate guy.
Yeah, corporate and all that stuff. But at the same time, he kind of liked it because the bands that Brandon was signing, he loved, and he wanted a relationship with Tooth and Nail because he knew that could mean some success for him and Take Hold.
I was talking to Brandon, not about music, not about label stuff, but somehow I had begun through Slacker 66 ordering a lot of music and merch from Tooth and Nail. I'd call Chad Pearson all day long and put in orders. I had talked to Bill Powers. And at some point, I don't even know how, but at some point, I must have communicated with Brandon. I don't know where or when that first email would have happened, but somehow I talked to him and emailed him, and I realized that both he and I liked Star Wars, and both he and I liked Star Wars toys. Like, we developed a friendship over Star Wars action figures that I was collecting, and we basically worked out this arrangement where I would pay my bills to Tooth and Nail in Star Wars action figures. So I would, I owed Tooth and Nail money, and I'm sure I suggested it because, of course, it's totally something I would suggest. Hey, Brandon, I'll send you the same, I'll go buy the same value of my invoices for Tooth and Nail merch, and then I'll just send you boxes of Star Wars figures. So he, for some reason, he's like, okay, I'll do that. So for a season, I was paying my bills. I was bartering Tooth and Nail merchandise with Star Wars action figures. and it was working. And I loved it. I was already going to Toys R Us and Walmart and Target buying up all these action figures because I was addictive and into all of it.
Okay, so what I hear there is that just being a character in itself is endearing and attractive, and you wind up creating relationships, and I'm sure Brandon at some point just is like, this guy's interesting. So you're paying attention to somebody because they're quirky or different.
Yeah, I mean, what you hear when Chad says that is it just makes me die laughing because he actually says, I don't know why Brandon would do that. Now, here's what's crazy. Brandon, we know Brandon, a lot of people know Brandon, is a phenomenal, very successful businessman. How in the world could some dude from Birmingham, Alabama convince Brandon to pay his bills in action figures? It's only because of his charisma. I mean, he says, I don't know why Brandon did it. The reason why Brandon did it is because when you know Chad, you love him.
Yeah.
There's no way you can't. You just do. And so he convinced Brandon Abel, owner of Tooth and Nail Records, okay, just pay me an action figure.
All right, well, I still want to know, what was Take Hold doing? What was there something special there?
I think in total we released 30-something records, but I can't remember off the top of my head how many bands. Maybe 15 bands. Take Hold lasted almost 3 years. and we were about $120,000 in credit card debt. So I studied psychology in college, not business, which I should have done. Psychology was the most worthless venture I ever went on for an academic purpose, kind of deal. But I learned a lot about Jesus during those times, so it's all good. I don't hold anything against the college. But
did you really I'm starting to make money, or it never?
No, Take Hold never made money. And Take Hold lost money consistently. My idea for a solid business plan was 10 credit cards and a bank loan. So there was a season early enough in my career where my credit history did not exist, and it just was like one credit card after the next. It's like they must have all been together in like a conference room, and they pull up my file and they're like, oh, Chad Johnson, he sounds like a pretty cool guy. We'll give him a bunch of credit. So they were like, oh, how much you guys gonna give him? 5,000. Oh, we'll one up at 10,000. So somehow by the end, I had all these credit cards that were about $10,000 worth of credit. And I was like, man, this is great. I can make records and this is no problem, like easy. I can pay for your record. I can put an ad in HM Magazine. I can, print 2,000 copies. And at the end of the day, I didn't know how to sell. Even though
you're sitting there, man, how much debt?
About 120,000. Which for a guy fresh out of college to now maybe 120 grand is not that. I don't know. I still think it's a lot of debt now, but at that point it was inescapable. Like there's no way I'm getting out from under this. I at that point felt like I needed to file for bankruptcy. And my wife, Beth, literally started praying. I, at that point, had already begun falling away from the Lord, going back to drugs and porn and all that.
So Chad just told us how awful he was a businessman, like really in debt and all that.
Right.
But amazingly, he got all these really cool bands to come on his label, which is what got the attention of Brandon eventually, right? So he put out the Further Seems Forever split EP before The Moon Is Down came out, which we talked about in the last episode. Mm-hmm. So that came out on Take Hold. And so I don't know if he really like kind of swooped in and undercut Tooth and Nail on that, but he definitely got to them first, technically, as far as putting out music goes.
Yeah, that's what I said this earlier, but it is so interesting to me that he has just unreal, like if you look at like levels of salesmanship, he has some things that are just unbelievable to where, of course, bands would like him and trust him. You trust him. Hey, this guy, but what he's saying is, hey, I just got 10 credit cards. I'll use it. Like there is no business skill there, but his salesmanship is unbelievable when he is just being himself. You go, wait, this guy loves our band and he means it. And this guy is going to do whatever he can to help us, even if that means take out unbelievable loans and do all this stuff. So at the same time, like it's once again, it's this weird duality of, man, this guy's awesome and he loves me. And also he's falling to pieces, like failing miserably.
All right, so we're going to hear some more of Chad's story after a quick word from our sponsors. And our sponsors today is Tooth and Nail Records, of course.
All right, folks, a huge amount of people use Spotify as their main source for consuming music. And we've learned that Spotify is especially great for two things. One, discovering new bands and new music. And two, strolling down memory lane and remembering bands and songs you haven't listened to in a while. And I do that a lot. I'm old. If you're anything like me, there's a lot of songs in your past. So you're going to hear a lot of music in each episode of the Labeled Podcast, both new and nostalgic. If you want to hear even more, follow Tooth and Nail Records and subscribe to some of our playlists. We have the Discover It playlist for new stuff, the Collection playlist for classics, and of course, the Labeled playlist for everything from the episodes you've heard and upcoming episodes as well. All right, Aaron, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. I'm going to talk really highly about your band, As Cities Burn. Over the years, it's kind of become more and more apparent that signing you guys was one of the best things Chad Johnson ever did. Not only were you guys a great band, but you influenced a ton of other bands as well. Both of your first albums, Son, I Loved You at Your Darkest and Come Now Sleep, are now available on vinyl in the Tooth and Nail store. Several color variants are available, so go add one to your vinyl collection right now. Head over to toothandnailrecords.merchnow.com to pick one up.
Okay, now back to our story. When we left off, Brandon Ebel, owner of Tooth and Nail, had offered to buy Take Hold Records from Chad, but Chad didn't want Brandon to know how much debt he's in. Meanwhile, Brandon is really starting to like Chad and be attracted to his charisma and sees the collection of talent that he has and his products and his CDs and the artwork, and everything seems to be working. So from his point of view, Brandon says, man, I could probably do something with Chad.
I was hiring people that had great potential in design, and so the CDs were looking better over time, and Brandon was beginning to see those. So he had reached out to me on a band from Memphis called Few Left Standing, a hardcore band. And he had said, hey, we like this band. Would you consider licensing this album to us for distribution? And I was like, wow. Like, all of a sudden, Brandon's my hero again, you know? Like, whoa, dude, you want, like, wow. Yeah, excuse me. Like, you are coming to me and you want my product to sit amongst your beautiful shelves of hundreds of MXPX and Slick Shoes and I don't know, all kinds of other awesome albums that I loved back then. I responded to Brandon's email and I said, you know what, instead of licensing only Few Left Standing, all of my artists really could use help because we were with Lumberjack Distribution and we weren't getting paid and they weren't selling anything and it was not good. So he responds with Brandon's known for his classic one-liners. So he literally responds with, how much do you want for your company? And I was, what, dude? How much do you want for your company?
So it went from, hey, let me license one of your bands to, I'll just buy your whole damn company.
Right. With no dialogue whatsoever. The follow-up line is how much for your company.
Which is hilarious because Chad doesn't even know what to say to that. He's thinking, he's weighed down by unbelievable debt. His wife is praying, scared out of her mind that she married this guy that doesn't know what's happening. And then Brandon just writes him back, how much do you want for your company?
Wow. That's the kind of thing that happens to people that it seems this way, that there's a lot of stuff that happens to people that put themselves in crazy positions, or especially in the spiritual world and in Christianity. It's like God will make a way, or we didn't know what was going to happen. We did this thing, and then all of a sudden this other thing happened. So that's that wild ride that people like Chad go on, and it never stops. But this is just one of those moments where you do something crazy and then it works out some other way.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny. Like, there is a real spirituality to Chad that makes you believe. Like, he just goes, he makes bad decisions, but he just is doing stuff. Like, he is making stuff happen, and it starts to work out. It's just crazy.
My wife was like, just ask him to cover your debt, and I didn't really want to tell Brandon, who's now went from my villain to my hero, that I had debt. You know, Brandon doesn't need to know that I have $120,000 in debt, at least until the day came where he asked me for all my financial information. And I was like, oh, crap. I have to send Brandon Ebel my spreadsheets of how poorly I've managed this whole thing. And now he's going to know how desperate I really am. But I was like, what do I do? Like, I can't just not send them. And so it was a quandary. And I was like, man, why does this guy need this stuff? And Brandon discovers that there's really not much to buy in Take Hold. At that point, I think the only thing that there really was to buy was the trademark. And I don't even recall, I don't even think Take Hold was trademarked. I think it was really, he was buying the logo and the name and the right to use the logo or the name. And then he was going to license all of the records that I had paid for. So really, those were the only two things that brought any worth to Take Hold. So, and he was going to bring me on and give me a job at Tooth and Nail, which he agreed to pay me for 3 years as a salaried employee. So he's basically giving me a chance. He's like, hey, I will get you out of debt. You're going to have to rewrite all these contracts with a lawyer, get your bands to re-sign them. But assuming they re-sign them and that you truly do own the rights to these albums so that you can license them to me, then I will license those albums from you for about $120,000 is what it ended up being at the end of the day.
So who are the Take Hold bands? Who did Chad discover and bring to Tooth and Nail?
Well, kind of a big deal in the long run for Tooth and Nail. Little band called Under Oath. Me Without You. .238. He discovered Norma Jean, who was Ludacris, while they were on Take Hold. It's just really unbelievable.
Yeah, so the bands that came with me, because basically all the bands on Take Hold had the option to go to Tooth and Nail. They weren't forced into it, and I didn't want anybody to feel forced. So the bands that came with me were Under Oath, 238, Few Left Standing, and then The Operation / Me Without You, but they were kind of more, it was like, hey, we're both heading to the same place at the same time. And then the bands that didn't go with me were Hope's Fall, that signed to Trustkill, Stairwell signed to Hopeless Records, and then I think a few bands had either broken up or just kind of went their own way that did not end up doing anything else. Further Seems Forever, Stretch, no, maybe that was Roy.
Okay, so now we have Chad on guaranteed salary for 3 years, and clearly Brandon sees him as the future. Both talented and capable, although you wouldn't know it hearing Chad humbly talk about himself, as you'll hear in a second as he explains this. But now he's got his roster of bands at Tooth and Nail, and he's interfacing with an existing label that already has bands and A&R guys and a whole system going. But with Chad's level of personal involvement and care for others that Brandon clearly recognized and had invested in, Chad goes from being the new A&R guy with a few bands to pretty much A&Ring every band on Tooth and Nail in just a matter of months. And this is all based on his charisma and level of engagement with people.
Basically, in a span of about 6 months to a year, the main thrust of A&R guys, who were Greg, Bill Powers, and Roy Culver, all ended up not being there. So then it was like most, not all, but most of their bands I ended up inheriting, largely because I had some level of relationship with them. So it's like, oh, well, Chad, it's not because Chad's good at what he does. It's because Chad knows you and you know Chad. All right, hey, Chad will be your A&R guy. There was nothing like, hey, Chad's awesome. This dude's really showing great potential. If anything, it was probably just how do we help keep Chad busy?
Okay, so at this point, you can see that Chad has basically the complete trust of all the artists on Tooth and Nail and has the business running at a very, very high level where the bands respect and trust the label for taking care of them with such a great guy like Chad. But this isn't just business to Chad. He takes it to another level and further invests into these young men's personal lives as a mentor and a guide and a spiritual leader, even becoming vulnerable with them to the point that it could threaten his own personal success.
Yeah, he's the perfect person. If you're in a band, you don't want to really talk about the money and all that stuff. You want just to know that the label cares about you more than, hey, they're going to give you $1,000 to do this or $10,000 to do that. Like, you just want to know that the label really is interested in your band and thinks your band is awesome. Chad is the guy for that.
Chad was actually my A&R guy. He signed at Cities Burn. And so he took great interest in our personal lives. Our band broke up while we were on Tooth and Nail, and he came to Cornerstone to try to keep us together. But he didn't come at it from a way of we didn't feel like we were being manipulated. He was like, "Look, I just really believe in you guys, and I think God is using you, and all this stuff." So he was really good at connecting with people on that level, and then eventually to the point where he started wanting to cultivate these like retreats and like kind of Bible studies, and went from not just being your advocate at the label for when you needed tour support when your band broke down, but to like, hey, let me make sure and pray with you and make sure you're not going to kill yourself while you're on the road.
Right. He was going to not only help your band, but help you get to heaven.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about these retreats. I never went to one of them, but tell me about the retreat stuff that he did.
Chad would get bands from the label. So in particular, this one, it was Under Oath, Me Without You, The Chariot, and As Cities Burn. And he'd say it was like a label band bonding type of thing. So go deep, get spiritual, get to know each other, pray together, encourage each other. And then when we're up there, he digressed into this whole confession about all these bad things he'd been doing the whole time he worked at the label.
I ended up, I think it was the second night of the retreat, and I basically just had everybody gather. There's about 40 of us gathered in this room, in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, up in this mountain, beautiful, epic fireplace and all the sweet stuff of retreats. And I just said, hey guys, I just want to confess to you that for the last few years, I have dealt severely with pornography in the sense of a daily addiction multiple times a day. I've relapsed into an addiction to marijuana to the point where at Tooth and Nail, I had a drawer of marijuana in a little tin. So I basically was apologizing for the fact that I was living a double life, absolutely. And I was on one hand a really nice guy. I was smiling. I was joyful. I was happy. I probably would have called myself a Christian, but I was hiding drugs from Tooth and Nail. I was hiding drugs from my wife. I was hiding porn from my wife. There was a season early on in the Tooth and Nail journey where Tooth and Nail was basically trying to figure out like where in the world Chad Johnson fit in, because I was Take Hold Records guy. So, you sign bands, you put out records, you know how to work with graphic designers and make posters and print CDs and do A, B, and C. So maybe you can do all these other things. So I was, for a season, I was doing like international distribution. So I was going to Europe I went to Europe several times, always stopping into Amsterdam because I was like, oh, they have really nice marijuana here. So, and I'm pretty sure that this would come as a surprise to Jim and Brandon and anybody who's still at Tooth and Nail. So it may be coming out on the podcast, but Brandon, Jim, I love you. Sorry. I was the guy checking the Fugitive Records P.O. box, which was a little like division of Tooth and Nail at the time that was going to try to go more towards mainstream bands. And I would check the P.O. box. And so I had this brilliant idea to ship weed back to myself from Amsterdam in a CD case, taking the inserts out, replacing it with marijuana, and then taping it all up, putting it in the mail anonymously. So had anyone like Jim, who's just brilliant and would absolutely know, this came from Amsterdam about a week and a half ago. Who do we have that was in Amsterdam a week and a half ago? And he'd be like, oh, surprise, surprise. Chad's up to something weird again.
Wow. So y'all are sitting there and Chad is telling you guys about drugs and porn and all these things that are going on in his life at the retreat.
It's funny because once again, Chad set this whole thing up for community, for a relationship, to help guys with whatever they're struggling with or wherever they're at with the Lord. And it really did end up being where he took the first step. So he steps out on a limb and just starts confessing all this crazy stuff to where the guys in the other bands were just like, well, if he's that wild, I'll just say something too. And so it ended up being probably a night where everybody was like, hey, once again, I love this guy. Golly, he's awesome. Mm-hmm. He'll say anything. He's doing drugs, being crazy, and at the same time a Christian. He's a lot like me. And so it makes you just feel great to be around this guy, even when you're saying the worst things about yourself. But at the same time, he still did other crazy stuff.
I remember going to Amsterdam with Brandon and saying like, dude, let's go to the red light district. And he was like, nah, dude, I totally do not feel comfortable with that. And I was the one trying to prompt Brandon into that. And I feel really convicted by that now because I actually recognize conviction now and I'm actually walking with Jesus now. But back then that kind of proves a little bit of where my mind space was.
Yeah, so Chad clearly there had a bunch of stuff that he was dealing with and going through there, and he confessed most of that at the Come and Die retreat that you were at, Aaron?
So that all happened at the retreat, and then me and Toby are interviewing him in his garage. 10 years later, there's more stuff that nobody ever even knew about.
I would sell Under Oath vinyl on eBay that was tooth and nail vinyl, and then I would take the money for that. So please forgive me, Brandon, for being an absolute idiot in some of the things I did at Tooth and Nail, because they weren't Christ-like. That wasn't who God had called me to be. That wasn't how I should have treated Tooth and Nail. They were paying me very fairly. They were being really wonderful to me.
I want to do a little caveat here. I have been emailing Chad back and forth, like since we hung out with him, we're friends again. You know, I haven't talked to him in a while, and now we're just friends again. I told Chad, I said, hey, anything that you don't feel comfortable with, we'll delete. We won't use. And I said, you know, if there's anything crazy, you know, you don't worry. And he said, no, everything's fine. I was like, even that stuff about, you know, Tooth and Nail and the records. He's like, no, I've already emailed Jim and Brandon, and I've told them the truth. Like that, once again, I can't believe it. This guy's like the most innocent, naive, generous, friendly criminal that you could ever meet.
It's nothing personal. It's nothing at all. It's nothing personal. I've just got to get you out of my blue veins.
So Chad stumbled into a new job, found himself in a position of power, and somehow led the way in the biggest period of growth in the history of Tooth and Nail Records, despite his moral deficiencies. Under Oath, for instance, had 2 gold records under their belt. Anberlin was selling out 2,000 cap rooms, and bands like Me Without You and As Cities Burn were becoming insanely influential and well-respected within the scene. But behind all that was a music business that was rapidly changing and making it more and more difficult each year for bands to succeed. And Chad became convinced that his efforts and skills would not even help the very bands and the people that he cared about.
The best storyline that has developed out of my life has been that God gave me grace to walk away from not only Tooth and Nail, but from the music world at the time that I did, in my own fashion and of my own desire, and that I wasn't kicked out of the door. I think that I had another 6 to 18 months of life at Tooth and Nail without either them coming to me and saying, if you want to stay here, that's cool, we love you, but you need to take a significant deduction in pay, or we love you, but sorry, you're just not delivering. I lost my passion. I lost my zeal. My email to Brandon and Jim before I quit was basically, I love you, but I have no zeal or no passion for what you're doing. And it's not fair to you or me to continue just pretending that I'll kind of, and I wonder maybe if some of those later bands suffered from the lack of my passion more than anything else. So they could, if they wanted to, blame me on some levels for just not having invested all of my heart into them, because my heart wasn't there. I was like, I don't care. I just want to know Jesus, and I just want to go after him, and I just want to become more like him. And I don't really care whether or not I sell another record ever in my life. And so it was like, well, clearly having heard that, you're not a good A&R guy. You should not be selling records for a record label. So, I think Brandon and Jim said, well, yeah, we've recognized that your passion is dwindling.
The interesting part about this is all of these things happen pretty quickly. Like, he doesn't stay anywhere too long. I think it just goes back to his missionary roots and being just such a spiritual, connected to the spiritual realm kind of person, to where all of these things happened really quickly. I mean, he started a label at Take Hold, and it blew up and failed within just a few short years. I mean, he picked all these great bands, and then all of a sudden he's out of debt and on Tooth and Nail, working with Tooth and Nail, but that only lasted a few years too, and he needed to move on. I think it's one of those things where he gets restless, stays in a place for a while, and needs to move to that new thing and that next thing, which led him to kind of start his own label with Come and Live, which was born out of the Come and Live tour and the Come and Die retreat, Aaron, that you were on. But he did this thing where he's like, hey, you know what? I'm not good at money, so what if we don't have to pay for records?
Well, in a way, that stuff is still advanced advanced as well. It's ahead of the curve on essentially crowdfunding and you know drawing support from your patrons and that whole movement that's really catching on now. Chad's been doing that for a while with the model of a nonprofit label where the music itself is free, also freeing him of business obligations.
That's what I think is really interesting about Chad, because he rarely gives himself credit. And even quitting his good job at Tooth and Nail to start a label that gives music away for free was ahead of the curve, like you said.
Everything he does is always one step ahead of everybody else, but he doesn't even necessarily acknowledge that or give himself credit for it.
Yep. This last clip we have of him talking about it, he doesn't even think that he could or has the skills to do what he did at Tooth and Nail again.
Yeah.
It's all luck to him.
And I think it would be foolish to try. Like, even if I went to Brandon and I was like, Brandon, please, like, give me a job, you know, dude, my life is horrible, and let me A&R your bands. Like, I'm so sorry. Yeah, please forgive me for all the vinyl I sold on eBay and all the stupid stuff I did. Even if he was like, dude, whatever you want, I'll do it, which he would never do, because that's never how Brandon rolled. But even if he said that, I couldn't deliver. There's no way. I'd be like, okay, like, hey, I'd be like, Aaron, can you guys tell me like where to start? Who are the good bands around? I'd be like, hey, on the road, do you guys know any good bands? I wouldn't even know where to begin. So where am I now? Well, I'm still sitting in my garage 8 years later. But in many ways, what I have in the sense of worldly success to show for the last 8 years pales in comparison to worldly success I had with Tooth and Nail. But for the last 8 years, I've just been growing with Jesus.
Okay, so I want to close this episode with a little bit of math, but don't worry, it's fun math. By my count, Chad A&R'd and was involved with around 50 bands. Now, most bands have 4 or 5 people. So just like that, we're talking about 200, 250 people that Chad was the A&R guy for. And that's not to speak of what he did when he left Tooth and Nail or his co-workers or other people that he encountered. Just the guys in bands that, as we've learned from this episode, that I think you have a glimpse of now, that Chad was their mentor, their brother, their father figure perhaps, somebody that prayed for them, somebody that invested in them personally, deeply, and authentically. Here's the crazy thing about that. These aren't just 250 people. These are 250 public figures that sold combined near 10 million records. So his influence is almost unimaginable, uncalculatable at least. And my favorite part about it is that he achieved it in large part due to his quirky personality and because people found him to be trustworthy, which he achieved by explaining to them directly just how untrustworthy he is by exposing and owning his flaws, because he's authentic and transparent and real. And in an era where people are less that than ever, especially in the music business, there is so many fake people and fake things. This guy cuts through, and he always did, and he's influenced other people, myself included, and many other people I know, to do the same. And I hope that just by spending 45 minutes with him on this episode, he's influenced you too.
And I'll be the one they take, and I'll be the one they try to break. And I've just begun now, and I'm not a lot, but you can have all of me. Be the one they take, and I'll be the one they try to break. And I've just begun now, and I'm not a lot, but you can have all of me. Never see me walk away. All I have is all I
Thanks again for listening. I'm your host and producer of the show, Matt Carter, along with Toby Morrell and Aaron Lunsford. This show is edited by Melanie Studley and Billy Power and mixed by Brett Baird. Thanks to our assistant producers, Reva Hansen and Marshall Fremuth, and special thanks to Adam Scatula from Tooth and Nail for helping to develop the show. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. And if you want to hear more about what Chad Johnson's been up to lately, might I suggest you go listen to mine and Toby's other podcast, The Bad Christian Podcast, badchristian.com, episode number 272 with Chad Johnson. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, and just to give you a little heads up, the next one is going to feature the enigmatic frontman of Me Without You, Aaron Weiss, who's the subject of many rumors in and of himself, and we'll get to the bottom of it. See you in 2 weeks. Make sure you tell a friend and leave us a review on iTunes.